Let's get started. Today's session is going to be about how do we monitor conversations in closed spaces? And we have three objectives of what we're going to do. First, we're going to look at the landscape of these closed groups and messaging apps, why they're important, why they're also particularly tricky when it comes to news and mis or disinformation. We're going to go through the ethics of monitoring these spaces and the questions that hopefully any journalist or researcher or health communicator asks themselves before they enter some of these spaces. And the last thing we're going to do is look at some practical tips of how you can find these spaces. In case you haven't joined us for the other sessions, allow me to introduce myself. My name is Laura Garcia. I am the training and support manager at First Draft, and you can find me on Twitter at LauraGRB. These sessions are meant to be self-contained, so don't worry if you haven't tuned in to any of the ones before. Today's session will include everything you need to know, but you can also go back and rewatch previous sessions if you want to broaden your knowledge of how to tackle vaccine disinformation. Let's get into it. So I think it's important to start by looking at some stats and realizing what is the scale of these spaces and therefore why they're important for us to consider them. Whether you are a journalist or a researcher or an academic, or you work in health communication or in marketing, anything. All of the stats that you see on the screen are globally. So for example, WhatsApp has 2 billion users all over the world. Facebook Messenger, the messaging part of Facebook, has 1.3 billion. And then there's also apps that are specific to different countries or preferred by different communities. For example, WeChat is native to China and is also linked to a lot of functions that you can do on the app directly, like buy things. Kakao Talk, is native to Korea. Telegram used to be super popular in Iran before it was blocked. Now you can only access it through a VPN. Line is very popular in Japan, in Taiwan, and in Thailand. And the one that all security experts prefer is called Signal because it's open source and it has extra layers of security. But regardless of where in the world we're talking about and what the preferred space is, what all of these spaces have in common is that it's a way that we interact mostly with people that we care about. It's your friends, it's your family, it's your work colleagues, it's the people you went to school with. And that means that if we're thinking about it from a disinformation standpoint, we are already more willing to trust the information these people are going to share with us because we like them, because we want to be part of their group, right? And that means that we are maybe less suspicious or less critical of the information shared in these spaces. Our guard is down because we're with our tribe. And it also is really hard for fact checkers and journalists to issue corrections in these spaces. Let's look at another part of why this is an important space to monitor, and it's because diaspora communities all over the world use these spaces as a way to keep in touch. I know that the only reason I still have Facebook Messenger on my phone, it's because that's how I talk to friends and family back home in Mexico, or WhatsApp, right? And that broadens the scope of the communities that you are monitoring if you start paying attention to these spaces. Sometimes it can also be really easy to assume that because we aren't on a specific platform, then nobody else is on it. But maybe it just means that you don't belong to these communities and therefore you're not into the same information consumption habits, right? So if you're starting to cover a new patch or an old patch or a new community or a community you're already in, maybe start asking some questions and ask people, what do they use to talk to friends and family? What are the apps where they share memes and screenshots and all these other kind of contents with each other, especially if we're talking about diaspora communities, because they bridge languages, they bridge geography, they bridge nationality or identity. And it makes that kind of networked nature of our audiences so much more global. And we see that all the time with disinformation that starts getting shared, for example, by Chinese speaking communities in the States, ends up in Hong Kong or vice versa. Same with Mexico. I've seen things, for example, that start to be shared by Mexicans who live abroad that then I end up seeing in my family chats. That bridge tends to be some of these closed spaces. And on top of the fact that these are spaces where we interact with people that we already like and that we trust and that we want to be a part of these groups, there's two more practical reasons that also drive people into these spaces. The first one is paywalls. Some news websites have paywalls to monetize their content, right? You need to pay a membership to be able to see news stories. And that's a good thing because people should pay for journalism because journalism takes time and resource and money to make and to do properly. But it does set a financial barrier of entry. So some people might be put off with that, and then it means that they turn to other spaces to get the information that they're looking for. The second one is something called free basics, which is that in some countries, some of these apps don't use up your data. So I remember, for example, when the internet on phones started to be a thing in Mexico back in, I don't know, like 2009, you could have WhatsApp and Facebook for free on your phone and it would not use up your data plan. And that is still the case in some countries, which means that the financial barrier of entry is even lower to exist in these spaces. And for some communities, their phone is the only interaction that they have with the internet. Not all of us have a computer at home or a desktop or at work. And particularly now that all of our world is mediated by screens because of coronavirus, then these three things, the fact that here's where we find our tribe, that paywalls sometimes put up a financial barrier of entry to news information, and that the usage of some of these apps is sometimes free and it doesn't use up your data, kind of drive people more and more to these spaces. Now, none of this is necessarily a bad thing. It's just important to understand the ecosystem that we're starting to look at. And it isn't just about cat memes and the latest things your cousins are up to. This is an excerpt of the latest study by the Reuters Institute for Journalism that shows the proportion of people that say that they use these spaces for news. Look at the percentages. 53% in Brazil, 50% in Malaysia use WhatsApp for news. 49% of people in South Africa say that they use WhatsApp for news. 41 in Hong Kong. Viber in other spaces, Messenger for news in different spaces. So that means that even though they might be kind of peppered with or what's the word I'm looking for? Like you get a cat meme and then you get a news story and then you get another cat meme. These spaces still become a place where people share news with each other. And we'll have a look at what that news looks like in a second. There's also been a distinct direction from the platforms themselves to make this pivot towards privacy. This is what Mark Zuckerberg called it in March of 2019, when he kind of set the direction for Facebook and the family of Facebook products, right? We have to remember that when we talk about Facebook, we're talking about Facebook and Messenger and Instagram and all of these other spaces. And it's kind of set a direction for close messaging as an option for people trying to avoid monitoring and targeting or harassment or even legislation in some countries all over the world that punishes you for sharing false information, right? And that pivot has been both on people and users' behalfs to be maybe less super public about all their information, and also from the platforms trying to get you to these spaces to find your tribe in a more safe way. And particularly when it comes to Facebook, it's even prioritized in the algorithm. Ever since that pivot to privacy decision, you will see on your Facebook feed, it prioritizes people and groups that things you're going to like rather than individual posts. So again, small nudges by the cost of accessing news or the algorithm that recommends you something first, or the fact that all your friends have moved on to this new space, all kind of shift us into these closed messaging apps. Interesting stats also from the Reuters Institute for Journalism. They asked people whether they use Facebook or WhatsApp groups to talk about news. And you can see on the left-hand side and on the right-hand side, there's one big difference. On the left, it is a priority. 51% of people use public groups. That means that they're with people that they don't know, but they are linked by an interest. And that of those 51%, 14% use it to talk about news or politics, and 18% use it to find out about their local community. On the other side, private groups tend to be more skewed towards WhatsApp. So people are more willing to be in a private group with family, friends, or colleagues on WhatsApp than on Facebook. But it's still pretty big across the board, right? We are finding these spaces to talk to people either that we know or that we have something in common with. And that can be the place that we live in, the movies that we like, the sport that we enjoy, the things we like to cook, anything. If we look at these four main ones in terms of the different services that they offer, WhatsApp offers end-to-end encryption, but, and this is an important but, group admins can create an invite link that then can be posted onto the internet. And there are ways of finding these invite links, and I'm going to show you how to do it in a second. But it means that something that feels really private, like a WhatsApp group, the moment the admin creates an invite link and posts it on the internet, it immediately becomes a publicly findable group that people can just join, right? Signal offers end-to-end encryption. It's open source and has self-destructing messages. So anybody who's into security really likes Signal. Telegram is not encrypted by default, but you can turn on something called secret mode that encrypts it. And WeChat does not offer end-to-end encryption. And these conversations about security and privacy aren't sometimes as public as they should be. We all end up jumping on the new platform because our friends are going there, right? Because otherwise you're going to miss out on these conversations. And journalists, we do it too. There was this big shift onto Telegram or Signal earlier this year because WhatsApp was changing their terms of service. Everyone moved together without maybe thinking about some of these different aspects that impact how we do our work and the data that we offer up. And in these spaces, like we've talked about before, misinformation travels fast because we trust the people who are in this group with us, and also because it's incredibly easy to forward information. Different apps have broadcast lists as well, which makes this easier to share. So for example, you can have a list of all of your schoolmates, and then it individually sends a message to everyone in that list with one click. And all of those properties together make misinformation and disinformation travel really quickly. The fact that these spaces are encrypted, as they should be, because people have a right to privacy and to have their own conversation, makes these conversations really hard to track and to measure spread. And it also means that the origins of falsehood are very difficult to verify, right? When you forward a photograph or a video on WhatsApp, it loses the contextual information around it. And that means that then figuring out where it came from can be really, really hard. And most of us don't do that because we trust what our friends and their family shares with us, and then we just forward it on. What you're seeing on the right, for example, it comes from Telegram in Iran. That's why it's in Farsi, so I can't read it. But basically, it's someone sharing what looks like a news story. And the headline says, there's a CDC report, which is the Center for Disease Control in the States, that says that more than 3,000 people were paralyzed after they had the COVID-19 vaccine. Now that shows you a preview of the picture. It shows you a preview of the story. And it's so easy to just trust the sender, click forward, and send it to somebody else. When in reality, if you click through, the whole story is imposter content. You can go back to our first couple of sessions to talk about the typology that we use to categorize this information. And one of the most common ones are imposter content. This one in particular is using the style and the look of news stories to make people believe that this is a real news story when it isn't. Let's talk about WhatsApp, because it's a really, really big one. Over 2 million users, active users from all over the world. It's the most popular messaging app around the world, and it's the biggest one in Brazil, Spain, in India. And again, depending on the diaspora communities you might be monitoring, it might be a really important one for the audience that you're trying to reach as well. And there are actors who identify that these are spaces that diaspora communities use to organize. And they are targeted specifically through these spaces because they know that information is easy to share, that you trust people who send it to you, and also that it's really hard to issue corrections. And one added layer of complication to that is language. So, for example, on the right hand side, you see an example that I saw on my WhatsApp groups in Mexico. And one thing that should immediately give you red flags is the fact that it says forwarded many times. Can you see that at the top? That is a measure that WhatsApp introduced in the last couple of years to help people realize how quickly information travels and maybe make them stop before they share again. This particular message, what it says that it's a translation of a message from someone who works with a pharmaceutical company and someone else from Harvard Business School. So already using big names that people trust. And the gist of the message is that COVID is real, but if you drink hot water with lemon every morning for a certain number of minutes in a certain number of ways, then you can eradicate the virus from your throat. And it's relying on these communities not being able to then go and check the original source in English. That's why it's translated, right? And that's why it's really easy to forward and why it's using the names and the institutions that people might trust. So I had to then intervene with the particular family member who sent me this. We did a little bit of investigation together to try and find the source. We couldn't find anything remotely related to this kind of information. The names of the people the message is using are real. They really work in these places, but their name and their authority was just borrowed for a message that was completely made up. We did a particular project around WhatsApp and disinformation during the presidential elections in Brazil in 2018. I was going to say 2018. And we linked up 24 newsrooms over a period of 12 weeks with a tip line, which we'll talk about in a second, where we were asking Brazilian people, send us the messages that you're getting on WhatsApp. We can check them for you. Give us anything you're seeing that you're unsure of before you share. Actually, maybe don't share it with us. And Comprova got over 100,000 messages. An entire report of all the findings of this project is available on our website in English if anyone's interested. But let me give you some of the biggest findings. So, visuals were most of the content that people sent in so that we could fact check. Look at that. Images over everything. For a couple of reasons. An image is self-contained. If I forward an image on WhatsApp, it already has all the information you need. Images are less heavy than video, so they're also easier to share for those of us who live with our phone storage almost dying all the time. And also, images are really visually compelling ways of transmitting information. And all of those things together make a perfect storm. We saw that most of these messages were also images or maybe sometimes screenshots, because if you can't access a particular news site or a different information space because there's a paywall, the easy way to do it is to share a screenshot, right? And some people would do that and forward these on. The other one, which is really difficult to investigate, were audio messages. Comprova saw a bunch of voice notes that had information that was either really emotional or that was stating some claims that weren't false, and they're really hard to trace back. We don't really have that many good tools that help us investigate audio other than just digging into the facts that someone's saying in a voice note. So for example, 30 viral audio messages, so just 30, were sent into the tip line over 1,600 times. It means that these 30 viral audio messages were everywhere and people were getting them from lots of places, right? In this particular case, because it was around elections, allegations of voter fraud made up the biggest part of that percentage. But we've seen that with COVID before, whether it's with the vaccine or with lockdowns. Someone forwards you a voice message of someone who claims to be a nurse or a doctor. And unless you actually do a bit of detective work, it's kind of hard to trace that back. And when you're thinking of interventions, right? Again, whether you're a newsroom or a researcher or anything, it's really important to consider the tipping point. We are going to do an entire boot camp discussing this idea further down the line in a couple of weeks' time. And I would really invite you to join us because it's where we're going to discuss this really delicate balance that we have to manage between the public risk that a specific message presents and the potential amplification that we are giving to this message by talking about it. And with closed messaging apps, it's really hard to measure spread, right? So for that WhatsApp message that I showed you of the ways that you can cure COVID by drinking hot water, it's really hard to know how many people are sharing that unless you have a tip line where people can send it in and then you can start to get a sense of spread. But it's completely different to, for example, searching for a hashtag on Twitter where you can see volume and quantity and then decide, am I going to make this worse by talking about a rumor, or is the risk of this rumor being out there already so big that it doesn't matter? And this is an example again from Comproba. This particular screenshot was shared 663 times into the tip line. So that means many more outside. And it shows a false conversation between the former president of Petrobras, Jose Sergio Gabrieli, and Fernando Haddad. And in the exchange, they're coordinating attacks on Bolsonaro, who eventually became president, together with Folha, which is one of Brazil's biggest newspapers, which is not true. It was doctored, right? And that was just sent over and over again, super easy to fake a screenshot of a conversation and then send it forward. Or, for example, the picture on the right. This is one of the most common images that we got during that project. And it has a ballot box on the back of a pickup truck. And people were sharing it saying, oh, this is how they're tampering with votes. It's horrific. Look at what they're doing. They're adding votes that weren't there. When in reality, it's just the ballot box in the back of a pickup truck, right? But it's the message and the narrative around it that changed that made it really, really powerful. Ethics, real quick. Whenever you're going into some of these spaces, what you have to kind of balance is the expectation of privacy of the people in these groups versus the public interest of going into them. Is it important enough for the story or the issue that you're covering that you go into some of these spaces where people might expect a certain amount of privacy? And there's tons of questions, from what is the size of the group? Have you tried to find out this information in a different way? Are you writing a story? Would you use people's names? Are you going to tell them who you are? Are you planning on entering more than one group? What is the potential public interest of what you're writing about? And all of these questions kind of balance them out, and there isn't a recipe answer. And the expectation of privacy is really important. This is a screenshot of a group of parents in Santa Cruz County in the States, where it specifically says this is a group for parents. So if you're going to go in to this group with 69 members, which is quite a small group, what are you going to say? Are you going to, what if you're not a parent, right? What if you don't live in Santa Cruz County? And are you going to ask, for example, are you going to answer, any initiation questions? Some of these groups have questions that you have to answer of what you believe in or where do you live. Are you going to answer truthfully? What does that mean for the ethics of you going into these spaces? Does it make a difference that this group has over 900 members versus the one before that only had like 69, right? And also the security risk that it poses for you. So when you're entering some of these spaces and these platforms, they might ask you to give identification details or even have access to some of your data through your phone. So being really aware of what you're giving as much as what you're taking by going into these spaces is really important. We have an entire write-up of 8 of the questions that you should think before joining any of these spaces, weighing up the pros and cons and giving you a place to start having these conversations with your line manager or your editor or your supervisor, especially if you're going into places that could potentially be hostile to you being in there, right? Quick, and then we're done. News gathering tips. So creating a tip line is really, really good as a way of finding out what people are sharing with each other in these spaces. Because you're saying, you're already on WhatsApp, send me what just forward it to me like you would to your cousin, and we will fact check it for you. This is a really cool article by Rest of World of how Line specifically is doing this in Japan. So Line has set up their own tip line where you can forward a message to them. And if it's already been fact checked by the group of fact checkers they've put together, they'll let you know. So they're going into these spaces and thinking about it, right? Your tip line goal should be to reach audiences that are more likely to be targeted because they are minority communities, because they speak a different language, because they're into a specific subject, partnering with community groups and people who are doing on the ground work with these spaces, and to build trust with these communities. To find some of these public links really quickly, 3 things and then we're done. You can use a site search to find public Telegram channels. If you type in site:/t.me and then whatever your search terms are, that will surface the link of public Telegram channels. And then you have to tell Google not to omit search results because otherwise some of these won't show up. And then once you're there, you don't have to join a group to view the content if it's public. You just have to click on the little thing under the green button that says preview channel. Easy to miss, but good to know, because then that means you don't have to join. This is obviously only for public groups, different for private ones, right? You can also search chat.whatsapp.com on any social media platform, plus any search term that you want, and it'll show you public invitation links that people will have posted to the internet. We talked about this before, right? So this means that you're finding them. Then the next question is, now that you found them, should you go in and how? We have an entire essential guide discussing the ethics and the technicalities of being in these spaces that you can find on our training page.